right, so you can see here we're going to be continuing next time to be talking about the new critics, mostly because they are actually really kind of important to understanding how American literary theory in particular develops. And Jeremy's going to be leading us through Wimsatt and Beardsley next time. So if you want to talk to me about that before you do so, please do feel free to come.
It'll be either today or tomorrow.
Okay, yep, great. Fantastic. Okay, so how many of you noticed some similarities between what Brooks was saying and some of what Victor Shklovsky was saying? Do they seem to have anything in common with each other?
From what I gathered, the straight approach to literature that they both have when it comes to analyzing, there's no, for lack of a better term, there's no fluff. It's like, okay, was this intentional? Was this what the writer was doing, or things of that nature? I'll wait for that.
Yeah, it's very much focused on precise attention to the text itself as an object, right? Much like the Russian formalists. Any other similarities you notice between Shklovsky and Brooks? I mean, that's the big one, right? The idea of the text as independent aesthetic object. And because we're dealing with literature as the medium here, right, then what is the object of study? Or what is a poem made out of? What's a story made out of?
Literally?
Literally.
Words,
yeah. So the focus in both Russian formalism and new criticism is predominantly on language. Now, one thing to note about these two different strands of criticism, even though they do share a lot of similar features, is that they developed completely independently of each other. The Russian formalists had no direct influence on the new critics, and vice versa. By and large, they weren't even aware of each other's work, with a couple of notable exceptions. They are in roughly the same time period, yeah. Like as was the case in the space program, the Soviets got there first. Right? They got their satellites up in the air before we did. But yeah, they're occupying roughly similar time periods, right? So what we call the new criticism is the dominant strand in American academic criticism from about the early 1940s to the late 1960s, at which point Marxist thought and various other sort of philosophical systems, mostly imported from France, become much more prominent in university level criticism anyway. So let's talk a little bit about where all this comes from and how it develops. Is everybody done with this, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, great. Then I will turn it off and get rid of this thing. Okay. So, the new critics' two main sources are a group of British critics, mostly based around Cambridge University in the 20s and 30s. Right, so they're heavily influenced by the work of a guy named I.A. Richards, who wrote two books what the hell are they called? Principles of Literary Criticism in 1924. And Practical Criticism in 1929. And by Richard's student, William Empson, who wrote a book called 7 Types of Ambiguity in 1930. Now, Empson, interestingly, left Cambridge in disgrace while he was still working on his master's degree because he was caught with condoms in his room.
Oh my.
He also had very eccentric facial hair. So if you ever, if you Google William Empson and find an image, really, really wacky mustache. But here's what they were primarily concerned with. So Richards made a distinction between types of language that very closely echoed that made by the Russian formalists, though, as I said, he was not aware of their work. So for Richards, common speech is intended to pass information. Right? Ordinary language just communicates an idea. Right? It consists of statements that refer to matters of facts, to use his own phrase. So what this means is that common speech always refers to something outside of itself, right? There's always some other referent. Poetry, on the other hand, consists of what Richards calls pseudo-statements. That appear to be referential, but are not. So essentially, a statement in a poem has no object of reference for Richards outside of that poem. Right? It doesn't mean anything when you take it out of that poetic context. Statements in a poem cannot be verified as true or false. And what poetic language is supposed to do is arouse and allay feelings through the interplay of conflicting attitudes and images. So the idea that's going to develop out of this is that a poem, a successful poem, is really a kind of paradox. Does everybody know what a paradox is? Okay, what is a paradox?
It's not necessarily paradise. It's a paradox.
I know
it's almost like
it's hard to explain what it is, right? It's, yeah.
With no answer.
Not quite. In language, what a paradox is a pair of statements that seem to cancel each other out,
Yeah.
but are both true. At least arguably, right? So Oscar Wilde, for example, used to kind of traffic in this sort of thing, right? The only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. One sort of famous truism that's a sort of paradox is to ensure peace we must prepare for war, right? So we see how this works. So essentially a paradox is a sort of balance or harmony between two things that ought to oppose each other. And that's what Richards argues a successful poem is, right? You've got opposite forces balanced in harmony within a poem, right? And you get that kind of poetic pleasure, you get that kind of reawakening towards sensation, much like the Russian formalists are talking about, right? Remember how Shklovsky talked about common language, practical language tends to deaden us to the world around us because it's about generalization and habit, whereas poetic language tends to wake us back up to the world of sensation, representing things to us in a new way. Richards would argue something actually quite similar about what poetry is supposed to in poetic language. Yeah, Jeremy.
So, and these people had no idea about each other.
Completely unaware of each other. Well, remember that the Opoyaz guys, Shklovsky and Boris Eichenbaum and Roman Jakobson, were working in the Soviet Union, which was largely closed to the outside world at the time they were writing. And their writings were then suppressed within the Soviet Union after 1920. So apart from those couple of guys who got out to Prague and then to Paris, yeah, their work was not circulated really widely outside of, well, really anywhere until the 1950s and 1960s. So yeah, so this is something, these are ideas that developed completely independently, but I think probably for similar political reasons. And let me just sort of briefly detour into that, right? So in the Soviet Union, and even in much of the British university system in the early 20th century, Marxism was, well, it was kind of de rigueur in the Soviet Union, right? Now, you were supposed to be looking at texts along Marxist lines, right? And by very doctrinaire Marxist lines, right? You were supposed to be looking at whether or not a text actually advanced the cause of revolution, right? Does this text advance the cause of the workers taking over the means of production? And there were lots of academics in Britain and the United States who were following along those lines as well. So formalisms of various sorts don't have an obvious political bent, right? You're just talking about words, you're just talking about language, you're just talking about what's on the page. And so formalism often became a space for more conservative critics to sort of push back against what they saw as leftist literary excesses, right? By paring down what you were supposed to be looking at to just the words on the page and not taking the text in its social context or historical context or anything like that. The sorts of things that Marxist critics were very much concerned with. So by making the study of poetry apolitical is actually kind of in itself a political act, right? So yeah, I think that's why we have these two similar systems developing in different places at the same time. They're both reacting to similar sets of political circumstances. And in the US in particular, in the 1940s, when new criticism really comes into its own, right? People are, this is like the beginning of the Cold War, right? So they're looking for a kind of homegrown system to push back against creeping Marxism. Does this make sense to everybody? Everybody following? Okay. So let's talk a little bit then about, so that's Richards, right? Now Epson is mostly concerned with this last word in the title of his book, which becomes a kind of dominant notion in new criticism, right? This idea of ambiguity. So, what ambiguity refers to, in new criticism particularly, is the multiple semantic or connotative meanings of words. Right, and the notion that words only mean anything in context, right? So when you have a word that could mean multiple things, in order to figure out which of those multiple meanings it carries, right, you can't do that by taking the word out of context. You have to look at the word in its proper context. So to give you an example of this, right, there's one of my personal, to go back to Oscar Wilde, right, one of my personal favorite Wilde quotes is, "Thought is not catching." Now the word catching is potentially ambiguous because it can be either a verb or an adjective, right? A sort of passive verb, like I am catching the ball, right? But as an adjective, it means something that spreads through contact, right? It refers to something that spreads through contact. So in context here, which of those meanings is most likely? Are we looking at a verb or an adjective here? We say thought is not catching.
Guess it'd be an adjective.
Yeah, the sentence would, so the structure of the sentence would suggest that it's an adjective modifying thought, right? Thought is not catching. And so we can sort of see through the logic of this statement, right, that thought is being compared here to something like a disease or a fad, right? Either of those are things that could spread through context. And a new critic would look at how this statement sort of resolves both of those potential ideas, right? That it contains both those potential ideas without ruling out either, right? Thought could be something that is not faddish. It could also be something that is not infectious, right? That is not contagious like a disease. Yeah, Jeremy, what did you say?
I was going to just, and under formalism, we describe that as ambiguity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When we're talking about resolving multiple possible meanings of words, yeah, we're looking at the multiple possible meanings are ambiguity, right? Now, most words also have, like in addition to an ordinary semantic meaning, right, a dictionary definition, most words also carry with them a set of connotations. So, would everybody more or less agree that these two words carry the same semantic meaning?
Yes.
Right? They refer to the same action, right? The same body function. But do we associate the same notions with these words? How are these words different? How do we use them differently in conversation?
Well, the word shit has more than one way. You can. There's different.
Usages.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Word
For one thing, you can use shit as an expletive, right? Like I stub my toe as I'm getting out of bed in the morning, right? I don't shout, "Oh, defecate," right? That was ridiculous. And you would not use both of these terms in the same company or in the same contexts, right? One of them is more of a sort of, biological term, and the other is much more casual and is regarded as somewhat vulgar, right? Does anybody know the reason, by the way, why one of these words is regarded as, why we actually have these two words that mean the same thing? What different layers of language we're talking about? This is actually one of the oldest words in the English language. You can trace this kind of directly back to Anglo-Saxon, in which it was not regarded as vulgar, it was just a word, right, for that particular function. But in 1066, when the Normans conquer England, all of the aristocracy are speaking French. So English becomes a vulgar language. And so certain words for things, particularly vulgar functions in England, or in English, in Anglo-Saxon, become naughty words or vulgar words, right? They're peasant words, right? Words that are spoken by uncultured, uncivilized people. Yeah. Whereas this word comes from Latin, which was the kind of lingua franca of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. And so most of our scientific and technical terms are still drawn from Greek and from Latin, right? These languages that were preserved by educated people. So that's why we have these two separate words in the first place. But yeah, knowing something about language and knowing something about sort of the connotations that surround words, the associations that we have with particular words, kind of helps you with process as a new critic. Now, the third, and I know that the term new criticism has become increasingly ironic as we recede further and further away from the era in which this was relevant. But I digress again. Okay, so the third major influence on this strand of criticism is the poet T.S. Eliot, who was also a very influential writer of literary criticism and editor. A lot of the younger generation of modernist poets in England actually worked with Eliot as their editor at the publishing house Faber and Faber. So Eliot starts with a sort of new approach to literary history, right? The usual idea we have of literary history is that it's a collection of great works and great authors that, through which influence is traced down in, a line going straight into from the past into the future, right? So Homer influences Virgil, influences Dante, influences so on and so forth, right? Right? Influence only goes one way. Eliot argues in an essay called Tradition in the Individual Talents that literary history is not simply a stable canon of great works influencing each other in a straight line, but is in fact a tradition which simultaneously influences and is influenced by the production of new work. Right? So when a new work enters the tradition, it changes the way we read works in the past as well. So influence, according to Eliot, is actually kind of two-way, right? Now, the benefit for this for a formalist critic, right, is that it takes historical chronology kind of out of the equation, right? You're no longer quite so worried about what work came first and who directly influenced what author, right? You're looking at all works of literature instead as a kind of net or fabric influencing one another equally. Now, perhaps more importantly for our purposes, in an essay called Hamlet and His Problems, Eliot defines a poetic device he calls the objective correlative. And the objective correlative is a formula, a poetic formula, for evoking a particular emotional response, right? That poets will use a particular formula the same way every time to try to get the same kind of response. So what he's trying to provide here is some kind of objective criterion, right, by which to judge emotional responses in poetry, right? So you know, emotional responses aren't just sort of generated by fuzzy feel-good vibes, right? He's trying to demonstrate that there are actually things in the poem, like uses of language in the poem that are meant to evoke particular emotional responses. And that you don't really need to go outside the poem to explain these. Okay. So this is where all of this comes from. Like these guys are writing primarily in the 20s and 30s, right? They're not new critics. They differ from the new critics in some ways. But these are sort of the basis for new critical ideas. Now, when we get to the new critics themselves, the major movers and shakers in this group in the 1940s are a group of American poets and academics, mostly from the South, mostly from conservative, gentlemanly backgrounds, who call themselves the fugitive agrarians. To describe their sort of distaste for mid-20th century industrialization. So these are guys like Cleanth Brooks, Alan Tate, John Crow Ransom, and Robert Penn Warren. Right, you know someone's background is aristocratic if they have three names. So they publish together mostly in journals like the Kenyon Review, based out of Kenyon College, and the Southern Review. And initially they propagate their ideas, yet mostly through relatively short articles, which they then collect into books, like Brooks's book, The Well-Wrought Urn, which refers in its title to this Keats poem that I distributed to you, right? So this is the poem that Brooks is talking about in the second article that you read for today, just so that you have that in front of you if you're not familiar with it. All right. So a couple of basic principles of new criticism here, right? So we already talked about the literature as a special kind of language. Right, so the critic's task is to analyze the interplay between specific words, rhetorical figures, right, metaphor, hyperbole, simile, what have you, and symbols within the fabric of the poem. They do not believe that form can be separated from content. Brooks himself uses a phrase that he calls the heresy of paraphrase. Right, essentially what he means by this is that you can't simply summarize a poem in practical everyday language and accurately convey a sense of its meaning. Right? That form and content are inextricably linked in a poem, that the form is part of the meaning. That if you try to pull those two apart, then what you end up doing is essentially simply destroying the poem. Right? So they do not believe that a poem can really be paraphrased. It can be explicated by picking apart words, rhetorical figures, and symbols, but it cannot be paraphrased or summarized.
So it's like,
Oh, read this poem. Well, basically, this poem is about
the struggle between good and evil. That's basically it. Instead of, well, here's points where it makes you feel the good or it makes you feel the evil. I got you.
Yeah, yeah.
Got you. Is formalism like would you say the basic way that most people learn how to analyze text?
Well, you know, people who are not formalists still use a lot of these techniques, right? This is actually sort of what I'm getting to next. Right? The basic method a new critic uses is called close reading or explication. In fact, there is there's still a journal that publishes mostly short articles in which scholars simply do this kind of analysis on a single poem that's called the explicator. So what close reading means, right, is close examination, like minute examination of the relationships between verbal and figurative elements in a work. So if you're doing a close reading of a poem, you are paying close attention to, for example, like the way the content or the imagery of the poem in some way mirrors the rhyme scheme, right? So to go back to a poem we talked a little bit about last time when we talked about Shklovsky, we mentioned John Donne's The Flea, right? Most of the poem is in rhyming couplets, right? So what a new critic or a formalist might do is look at that from, okay, so this is in couplets, right? And clearly, like what the speaker is trying to do is couple with the woman he's talking to. But then at the end of each stanza, we have a triplet rhyme. So that's referring then to the speaker, the woman he's trying to seduce, and the flea that is their go-between, right? So you're making connections between the content of the poem and the form. Right? That's the basic way you do explication. Yes?
What's it says relationships between blank and figurative.
Verbal and figurative elements. Yes. Yes. And there was something I was going to mention here where I don't remember now what it was, because I slightly sidetracked and didn't sleep well because the dog was whining. Okay. Right. One thing to say about all of this, right, is that the new critical method works a lot better on poetry than it does on anything else. It works best on short pieces of text with a clearly defined form that you can actually sort of, pull apart the form and the content easily. It doesn't work very well in novels. And in fact, very few of these guys really developed any kind. Like, you remember the formalists did make that distinction between plot and story, right? And they did develop a means for talking about longer works of prose fiction. The new critics never really do that. They really kind of, confine themselves to poetry. Now that said, they don't worry too much about genre distinctions. They don't really talk about genre as a category to be concerned about. What they do argue is that all literary works should be taken as dramatized utterances. Now, what that means in practice is that if you're reading a lyric poem or a short story or a novel, even if the word I recurs frequently, you are not to take that speaker or that narrator as a stand-in for the author. The speaker in a poem is always a dramatized character. The narrator in a story or a novel is always a dramatized character. Right? You are not getting the author's feelings and impressions straight from the author's mouth, right? That's not the way they think this works. Let's see, and what else? Okay. So, how would they actually go about picking a poem apart then? Well, first off, any literary work is basically a structure of meanings, right? That is, it's a set of verbal figures built around a significant theme that pull apart and ultimately harmonize, right? So the key words, right, are theme, the basic idea that the poem is dealing with, right? Some theme of great human significance, right, that the poem is dealing with. Right? Paradox, right? The way the poem presents and resolves opposing notions. Ambiguity, that is, the way the poem incorporates or resolves multiple possible meanings of words. And irony. Now, the semantic definition of irony, right, is saying the opposite of what you mean. That is not what the new critics mean by irony. What they mean by irony is any statement that seems to undercut or to qualify or limit itself within the poem. So when a poet makes some sort of declaration and then says something else that undercuts that declaration within the poem, right, then that's an example of poetic irony, right? And these three features are supposed to create a tension within the poem, right? They threaten to pull the poem apart, but if the poet skillfully resolves them, it creates instead a harmonious unity.
Will you always have those three?
Yes, any poem will have those three features, according to a new critic. Now, whether or not they successfully resolve them is an open question. But this is the measure for a new critic of how you judge a poem's success or failure. Right? These are the important things to look for within a particular poem. And if we look at Brooks's reading of that John Keats poem, the Ode to Grecian Urn that I passed out to you, right? The essential tension that he's looking at in that poem is between the stillness of the art object, right? The object itself does not move, does not speak. And the illusion of motion in the scenes painted on the urn. Right, but it's a motion that's never resolved, right? The people going off to the religious ritual will never finish that ritual and go home. Right? The city that they left will remain forever empty. There's a scene on the urn in which a man is leaning in towards a woman for a kiss. Right? He will never kiss that girl. Right? The action will always remain incomplete. And yet, the poem is perfectly balanced between this sense of motion that the pictures give us and the stillness and quietness of the object itself, right? That's the basic argument of Brooks's piece there, right? So, do you guys have any questions about either of these Brooks essays or anything he says in the essays? Or about new criticism more generally as I've presented it to you here?
I can't find the passage where he was talking about something along the lines of the understanding the writer's intention, or not the intention, but it might be intention. The right word might be intention. I have to find it.
Do you remember which of the two essays it's in?
The first.
The formless criticism. Okay, let me. Is it this, right? On page 16. In the first place, to make the poem or the novel the central concern of criticism has appeared to mean cutting its loose from its author and from his life as a man, with its own particular hopes, fears, interests, conflicts, etc. A criticism so limited may seem bloodless and hollow. It will seem so to the typical professor of literature in the graduate school, where the study of literature is still primarily a study of the ideas and personality of the author, as revealed in his letter, his diaries, and the recorded conversations with his friends. It will certainly seem so to literary gossip columnists who purvey literary chit-chat. It may also seem so to the young poet or novelist, beset with his own problems of composition and with his struggles to find a subject and a style and to get a hearing for himself. Is that more or less what you were?
I found it.
Okay.
17, once you read it.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
The
Yeah, sure.
The formalist critic, because he wants to criticize the work itself, makes two assumptions. One, he assumes that the relevant part of the author's intention is what he got actually into his work. That he assumes the author's intention as realized is the intention that counts, not necessarily what he was conscious of trying to do or what he now remembers he was then trying to do.
Okay.
I think that was it.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, so basically, if we want to condense that statement down, right, what the author's intention was to write a poem. And to, write a poem that is perhaps organized around a particular central theme. And we should judge the work based on how successfully it does that, rather than by how successfully it mimics some other statement of the author's, or I think he talks at some point about Ernest Hemingway saying that he thinks his latest novel is his best, right? His basic response is, okay, well, who gives a shit, right?
It doesn't matter because it has no effect on the work itself.
Yeah, Hemingway's opinion of the work does not affect the way I read it, right? It doesn't, his opinion of the work does not affect the interplay of these various forces as they interact within the work.
To me, it was just underlining the very fact that you remove the author entirely when
Mhm.
viewing whatever work you're looking at.
Sure. Yeah. What he's trying to do is achieve some sort of independence for literary study as a discipline, right? I think, I may have noted this on the first day or the second day or whatever, right? Did I mention the Isaiah Berlin essay from the 50s about the fox and the hedgehog? Okay, so it's the basic idea is taken from an ancient Greek poem. There's a line in which states, the fox knows many things, the hedgehog knows one very important thing. Literary scholars tend to be foxes rather than hedgehogs, because in general, it's useful to know a little bit about lots of different stuff. But what that means is that literary studies as a discipline has often been dependent on other disciplines for methods of reading, right? So we adopt ideas from anthropology, we adopt ideas from psychology, we adopt ideas from architecture, from art history, right? From linguistics, right? From all sorts of things that are maybe even only tangentially related to what we really do. And what the new critics are trying to do is move us away from that, right? And say, no, actually, the literary object itself is worth studying on its own terms. We just have to figure out and define exactly what those terms are. So are there other questions you guys have about Brooks or about this essay? Anything else that struck you as interesting or confusing or?
Well, as far as interesting, I did ambiguity. I've been trying to figure out what the right word or terminology was to what I was doing when I was looking at reading in class. And I finally figured out what it is today with ambiguity. Finding that there, with the connotation of words, that it could bring a different meaning to or the poem, or even I see a lot in the Bible.
Sure.
Especially when people interpret, well, this story means this. Well, he used the word like, for example, the scripture. He came to that we have life and have it abundantly. What do you mean by what is life?
There's a good if the study of biblical prose is something that interests you, there's a really good book by Robert Alter. I can't remember the title of it off the top of my head, but it's essentially a study of the kind of unique features of biblical prose and what distinguishes it from other ancient Near Eastern literary styles. But yeah, it is basically kind of formalist in its approach. So that might be something of interest to you. To go back to sort of the whole idea of ambiguity and how connotation relates to that. Let's just sort of take a word that has a number of associated ideas, right? And try to pull some of those apart, right? So if I give you the word rose, right? Literal semantic of meaning of rose is what?
Flower.
Or
To rise.
Right.
okay. Yes. Okay, so it can be past tense of rise, right? Usually when we use the word as a noun, right? Right, that would have to be determined by context, right? We're talking about a particular kind of flower, right? And what features does this flower typically have?
Thorns.
Okay, thorns, yeah. It's a thorny flower,
Fragrance,
fragrant,
usually red.
usually red in nature, right? Grows in bushes. Now, what ideas do we associate with the rose? Okay, yeah, romantic love, right? Yeah, love and sexuality. What other ideas do we tend to associate with roses?
Yellow roses are for remembrance.
Okay, yellow roses are for remembrance, right? But that's then a specific shade of rose, right? If we're just sort of thinking about the rose more generally, what other ideas do we associate with the rose?
Pruning, right?
Pardon?
Pruning. As for me, when you have to, cutting the rose bush.
Yep, cutting, okay. There's also a sense of potential danger associated with the rose, right? Because of the thorns.
It's also generally used as a symbol of beauty or charisma.
Yeah. So one thing that we would try to determine from context, right, when this image appears in a poem, this word appears in a poem, is which of these connotations, right, which of these associated meanings the poet is trying to incorporate here. And a skillful poet, according to a new critic, will incorporate several of these possible meanings, right? Even those that seem to contradict each other, and resolve them into some sort of harmony. So what I would like you to try to do, I've given you a W.B. Yeats poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree. And I'd like you to take a few minutes, read this poem, see if you can isolate a theme, and look for paradox, ambiguity, and irony within the poem, right? Statements that seem to cancel each other out without actually canceling each other out. Potential multiple meanings of words. This includes connotation, right? And statements that seem firm but undercut themselves in some way, right?
Which one are we looking at? I'm sorry.
The Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. is.
Or linnets, wings.
Linnets are birds. Pardon?
I would not butterflies. Just for that.
Uh-huh. Linnets are birds. Just take another 2 or 3 minutes and see if you can at least pick apart sort of the major, like the most important images in the poem. Oh, joy. That's just great.
That was in color. My dad carried it.
Okay, so can everybody at least gather from context here what Innisfree is? I'll give you a hint, it's in the title. Yeah, it's an island. Yeah, it's an island in the middle of a lake in Western Ireland. So, what does the speaker seem to want from his retreat to this island?
Seems he kind of just wants a fresh start and find some peace from whatever kind of crap he's going through. At least that's what I'm kind of
Okay.
gathering.
Peace.
I know that's kind of basic, straightforward, and probably not what you're looking for, but
No, that's actually very important, right? So how does he expect to get peace out of this island? Like, what about this island is going to give him peace?
Isolation.
It's the isolation, right? He will live alone here on this island. Yeah. So peace through isolation. Is he on the island now?
no, he's about to go there.
Yeah, he will arise and go, right? But he has not done so yet. So there's this tension between where he is now, right, and where he wants to be, and whether or not he will ever get there. Right? The vision of Innisfree that he presents, right, we find by the end of the poem is imaginary, right? This is not, he hasn't actually been there yet. Now, so if he wants peace through isolation, right, is there anything in the poem that undercuts this idea of peace
Elaborate.
Peace for him, is it just without people? Because there's plenty of noise.
Yeah, it's not a very peaceful place in terms of like actual level of
Yeah.
noise, right? Yeah, we have, we live alone in the bee loud glade, right? Peace comes dropping slow, but where the cricket sings, he hears lake water lapping, right? In every stanza, he hears some kind of sound, right? So there is a tension in the poem between peace and noise.
Well, it doesn't necessarily. Well, maybe he's not necessarily looking for peace as in quietness, but just peace as in I don't gotta deal with all these people I had that are around me right now. All these mofos.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, while I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray, right? So what does that suggest about where he is now? Yeah, he's in the city, right?
City life's probably just not for him, so he's like,
Mhm.
bye y'all,
Yeah.
toodles, hasta la vista.
So these are at least natural noises, right? But then, in order to live alone and peacefully in nature, what does he have to do?
Get the heck out of there.
He has to build a thing, right?
Oh yeah, that's true.
He has to go and build a shelter, right? So he has to make an artificial thing in nature in order to live in harmony with nature, right? So there is this tension as well between nature and artificiality, right? He has to build a cabin. He has to plant his 9 bean rows. It seems like a very specific number of bean rows, and I hope he doesn't intend to live solely on beans.
Honey.
Okay, and honey, right, yes. A hive for the honeybee, right? He has to build that as
And
well,
there's a
right?
lake, so we have that.
Conceivably, yeah.
Wait, what? I heard about that. I didn't hear what you said.
I said there's a lake so we can fish.
Oh yeah, that's true. And drink water.
Right. Yeah, Jeremy.
So you mentioned about, how did you catch, the whole time it didn't occur to me that he was always listening. Were you looking for that or?
It's the key words in the poem.
Exactly, yeah. There's that, right, these
Be loud.
yeah, these patterns of sound words that we see. That's like one of the key elements of close reading is paying close attention to patterns of language, like patterns of related words, patterns of related images. So yeah, just about in every stanza there's something that makes a noise, right? And never does he describe this as an unpleasant noise or an unwelcome noise, right? Despite his apparent desire for peace.
Seems to me like those are the sounds that he longs to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's how he finishes too. He talks about him standing on the roadway and on the pavements, but he hears it in his deep heart score.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, these are not sounds he's hearing with his ears, right? Of course, because he's not freaking there. Right?
He's listening.
He's listening with his heart, yes.
Oh my
Yes.
god. I cringed internally as I said that. Oh,
Yeats says it a little more artfully than you did.
yes. Yes, he does.
But yeah, like the idea is, this vision of island peace calls to her. The vision is like the image that he gives us of his retreat on Innisfree is coherent and makes sense, even though these ideas are in tension with each other, right? There is still a kind of harmony in the image.
Where's the irony?
Well, the irony, I think, is relatively mild, but it's in these oppositions here, right? Where he undercuts his desire for peace by giving us things that are noisy, and where he undercuts his desire to be one with nature by noting that in order to do so, he has to make things, right? He has to provide things that are artificial. All right.
The
noise thing said that, and I'm like, y'all can't read through it.
What is the first thing that
Sound
jumped
weird.
out?
But I mean that's that's why it's close reading, right? It's, yeah, it's you pay very, very close attention to patterns of language and how particular words are related to each other. All right, so it's 10:45, so I'm going to let everybody go. We'll continue along these same lines on Wednesday, where we're talking about Wimsatt and Beardsley. Does anybody need the Wimsatt and Beardsley article? This is the last one that I can give you without potentially breaking the law. So if anybody needs it, let me know on your way out. Otherwise, we'll see you Wednesday.